You know, there's something about procrastination that digs its claws into all of us at some point. Like an old rattler coiled in the shadows of our minds, waiting to strike at our best intentions. Let me tell you something about Ryan Reynolds, a man most folks see as having it all figured out. Behind that quick wit and million-dollar smile lies a story that might just hit closer to home than your morning coffee. Consider this. Here's a man who's built himself an empire bigger than Texas, spanning from silver screen to business ventures that'd make your head spin. Yet every morning, he faces the same demon that's probably sitting on your shoulder right now. That whisper saying, maybe later. Truth is, that whisper's as old as time itself and the ancient Stoics. Well, they knew a thing or two about silencing it. You see, back in 2018, Reynolds did something most folks in Hollywood wouldn't dare. He opened up about his lifelong dance with anxiety and procrastination. Not the kind that just makes you put off mowing the lawn, but the sort that can freeze a man solid right before stepping onto a talk show set. And that right there? That's where our story takes root. Let me tell you something about transformation that might change the way you see your own battles. It doesn't come wrapped in golden paper with a fancy bow. Sometimes, it's in those quiet moments when you decide to face what's right in front of you, armed with nothing but ancient wisdom and the kind of determination that builds empires. That's what Reynolds did, and that's the trail we're fixing to follow today. Welcome to Rise Stoically, where we take timeless wisdom and show you how it's playing out right here, right now. And this isn't about dusty old books or philosophical debates that had put a cowboy to sleep. This is about real people facing real challenges and finding their way through with principles that have weathered every storm time could throw at them. What we're about to explore isn't just another Hollywood success story. It's about digging deep into how one of the industry's brightest stars faces the same shadows that darken your door and mine. Through Reynolds' journey, we'll uncover 6 fundamental principles that turned procrastination from a mountain into a molehill. You see, this isn't about becoming Ryan Reynolds. It's about understanding how ancient wisdom, when applied with the kind of grit that builds character, can reshape the way you face every challenge that comes knocking at your door. Principle 1. The dichotomy of control. You know those mornings when the weight of everything you've got to do feels heavier than a freight train? When every task on your list looks like it could swallow you whole? That's where we find Reynolds, sitting in his trailer before a career-making moment, his mind running faster than a horse at the Kentucky Derby. Let me tell you something about control that might just change everything for you. There's wisdom older than the hills about what's yours to carry and what isn't. Reynolds discovered it the hard way, through years of letting anxiety build up like storm clouds before every project. But here's where it gets interesting. His breakthrough came when he started drawing a line in the sand each morning, clear as day, between what he could change and what was just noise in the wind. You see, when he took on that first major production role, the pressure wasn't just knocking. It was trying to break down the door. Critics sharpening their pencils, studio executives watching every move, fans holding their breath. But instead of letting all that noise paralyze him, he did something that'd make those ancient Stoics proud. He sorted out what was his to control and what wasn't, just like separating wheat from chaff. Now here's the truth about control that most folks miss. It's not about ignoring what you can't change. It's about recognizing it, tipping your hat to it, and then turning your full attention to what's actually in your hands. Reynolds learned to treat those uncontrollable elements like weather on a film set. You acknowledge it, plan for it, but you don't waste energy fighting it. The real power of this principle showed up when he started branching out beyond acting. You see, launching a business venture is like trying to tame a wild horse. There's only so much you can control. When Reynolds stepped into the business world, he faced a market that was about as predictable as a tumbleweed in a tornado. But instead of letting that uncertainty freeze him in place, he zeroed in on what he could influence. Quality of the product? That was his territory. The authenticity of the marketing? His domain. The way he showed up every day to build something meaningful? Well, that was as much in his control as the reins in a rider's hands. Everything else, market trends, competitor moves, economic wins, he learned to acknowledge and let roll by, like clouds on the horizon. And you know what happened when he started focusing on just his piece of the puzzle? The paralysis that used to grip him started loosening its hold. When you're clear about what's actually yours to handle, taking action becomes as natural as breathing. It's like the fog lifts, and suddenly the path ahead is as clear as a desert highway at dawn. Let me tell you something about what this means for your own battles with procrastination. Every time you're staring down a task that seems bigger than Texas, remember Reynolds' approach. Take that mountain of worry and sort it like a rancher sorts cattle. What's yours to handle and what isn't. Pretty soon you'll find yourself moving forward instead of standing still, taking action instead of getting lost in the what-ifs. Principle 2, the present moment and micro-progress. You know what's mighty peculiar about time? Most folks spend their days either tangled up in yesterday's regrets or chasing tomorrow's worries. But Reynolds discovered something powerful about this present moment we're all standing in. It's the only place where anything ever really happens. Let me tell you something about how this man tackled projects bigger than a Montana sky. When faced with a role that required him to play multiple versions of the same character, the kind of challenge that'd make most actors want to pack up and head for the hills, Reynolds didn't let the enormity of it all freeze him in place. Instead, he discovered what the ancient Stoics knew, that this moment right here is the only one you can actually work with. You see, procrastination has a way of making everything look like one giant, unclimbable mountain. But here's where it gets interesting. Reynolds developed what he calls his time slice technique. Instead of seeing the whole overwhelming journey ahead, he'd focus on placing one foot in front of the other, like a tracker following a trail through unfamiliar territory. During one particularly challenging production, the kind that could make or break a career, Reynolds found himself facing a script thick enough to choke a horse. Rather than letting the size of it all send him running for cover, he broke it down into what he calls achievable moments. Each scene became its own world, each line its own opportunity. He wasn't trying to climb the whole mountain in one day. He was just focusing on the next step up. Now here's something about the present moment that most folks overlook. It's not just about breaking things down small, it's about finding the power that exists only in the now. When Reynolds stepped into a role that required him to master complex technical dialogue, he didn't waste energy worrying about the 20th page while he was working on the first. He gave each moment his full attention, like a craftsman focused on one precise cut at a time. The real beauty of this principle showed itself during the development of a challenging action sequence. Instead of getting lost in the complexity of the entire choreography, he approached each movement as its own complete universe. You can't fight tomorrow's battle today, he'd say, but you sure as hell can perfect this one punch, this one block, this one moment. This way of thinking transformed every aspect of his work. In meetings about upcoming projects, while others were getting tangled up in long-range projections and what-ifs, Reynolds kept bringing the focus back to what could be done right now, in this moment. It's like the old saying about eating an elephant, one bite at a time, except he made each bite count. Let me tell you something about how this changes everything. When you're fully present in what you're doing right now, all those fears about what's coming next start to fade like morning mist in the sun. Reynolds found that procrastination loses its grip when you stop trying to solve next month's problems with today's energy. Principle 3, embracing discomfort through intentional adversity. You know how a blacksmith strengthens steel? It ain't by leaving it in the comfort of cool shadows. It's by thrusting it straight into the fire, just like breaking in a new pair of boots. That initial discomfort is telling you something's changing, something's growing stronger with every step. Reynolds discovered something similar about battling procrastination, something that goes against everything our comfort-seeking minds tell us. Let me tell you something about the nature of growth that might change how you see discomfort. It's like taming a wild horse. You can't do it from outside the corral, and you're bound to get some bruises along the way. When success started flowing his way, Reynolds noticed a dangerous pattern forming. The easier things got, the more he found himself hesitating when real challenges came knocking. The ancient Stoics had a remedy for this that'd make most modern folks scratch their heads. They deliberately sought out hardship. Now here's where it gets interesting. When preparing for one of his most demanding roles yet, Reynolds didn't just stick to the usual script preparation. He treated discomfort like a rancher treats rough terrain. not as something to avoid, but as the very ground that builds sure-footed strength. He threw himself into studying advanced stunt work in the scorching summer heat, learning complex technical skills that weren't even in the script, and voluntarily taking on the kind of physical challenges that'd make a seasoned stuntman think twice. You see, this wasn't about making things harder just for the sake of it. It's like building a fence in rocky ground. Every post hole you dig makes the next one easier, even though each one tests your resolve. What Reynolds calls his discomfort muscle ain't much different from what happens when you break a horse to saddle. Every session builds trust and strength, even through the bucking and the fighting. The real test of this principle came during a project that pushed every one of his boundaries. Like a cowboy facing his first cattle drive through mountain country, he knew the only way past the fear was straight through it. Instead of waiting until he felt ready, that mystical state that never seems to arrive, like waiting for a perfect spring day in December, he started each day by tackling whatever task made him most uncomfortable. Let me tell you something about what this kind of intentional adversity does to a person. It's like watching a desert plant grow through cracked earth. The very resistance that tries to stop it becomes the force that makes it stronger. Reynolds discovered that by regularly exposing himself to controlled discomfort, like a rancher who works in all weather, the tasks that used to paralyze him started feeling more like familiar territory. This principle showed its true power when unexpected challenges came rolling in like storm clouds over open prairie. Because he'd built up his tolerance for discomfort, just like leather gets supple with use, Reynolds found himself able to face sudden script changes, production challenges, and business curveballs with the kind of steady nerves that come from regular exposure to adversity. It's like an old ranch horse that doesn't spook at lightning, not because the lightning's any less bright, but because that horse has learned to trust its own strength through countless storms. Principle 4. The power of preparation as action. You know what separates those who conquer their fears from those who let their fears conquer them? It's not talent, and it sure isn't luck. It's the quiet work they do when nobody's watching, like a farmer tending his fields long before harvest time. Let me tell you something about preparation that Reynolds discovered, something that turns everything we think we know about procrastination on its head. Most folks see preparation as a kind of waiting room before the real action starts. But Reynolds, he learned to see it as action itself, as vital as the air we breathe. Now here's where it gets interesting. When preparing for a role that required him to portray someone with a highly specialized profession, Reynolds didn't just memorize his lines like most would. No, he dove into that world like a prospector who'd just spotted gold. Every morning, before the sun had a chance to stretch its legs, he'd immerse himself in learning, not because he had to, but because he'd discovered that deep preparation has a way of silencing those voices that whisper, "Not yet." You see, this kind of preparation isn't about perfectionism. It's about building foundations stronger than bedrock. While working on understanding a complex industry for an upcoming project, he'd spend hours absorbing every detail, every nuance, every unwritten rule. Not to delay the actual work, mind you, but because he'd learned that true preparation is like laying down tracks for a train. Once they're there, forward motion becomes almost inevitable. This principle revealed its true power when Reynolds faced a project that seemed about as approachable as a rattlesnake in a bad mood. Instead of letting the enormity of it all push him into paralysis, he broke down his preparation into what he calls knowledge territories, small, conquerable pieces of understanding that, day by day, built up into an unshakable foundation. Let me tell you something about how this changes everything about taking action. When you're thoroughly prepared, procrastination loses its favorite weapon: uncertainty. It's like being caught in a storm. The difference between panic and confidence isn't in the strength of the wind, it's in knowing you've built your shelter right. The beauty of this approach showed itself most clearly during a high-stakes presentation. While others might have paced and worried, Reynolds had already lived the moment 100 times in his preparation. Every possible question, every potential scenario, every conceivable challenge, he'd walked through them all in his mind, not as a way to delay, but as a form of action itself. You see, while preparation builds the foundation, there's another piece to this puzzle that might surprise you. Just as nature teaches us that every season has its purpose, times for planting and times for letting the field lie fallow, Reynolds discovered something powerful about the spaces between action. Principle 5. The value of strategic pausing. You know how sometimes the hardest thing to do is nothing at all? Like a river knowing when to slow its current before the rapids, understanding that rushing forward ain't always the wisest course. Well, let me tell you about a discovery Reynolds made that goes against everything our rushed world preaches. Let me tell you something about the art of pausing that might just change how you see action itself. It's like watching a master tracker read signs in fresh snow. Knowing when to move quick and when to stay still can mean the difference between finding your quarry or losing the trail altogether. During a particularly demanding creative project, when the pressure was high as an August sun, Reynolds stumbled upon what those ancient Stoics knew all along, that sometimes the most powerful action is a deliberate stillness. Now, here's where it gets interesting. When faced with decisions that could reshape entire projects, Reynolds developed what he calls conscious deceleration. Not the kind of pausing that comes from fear, like a horse spooked by shadows, but the kind that comes from wisdom, like a seasoned ranch hand reading weather patterns before moving the herd. He learned that slowing down actually speeds up the journey to the right destination, just like taking time to sharpen your axe makes the cutting go faster. You see, in the midst of developing a complex character, Reynolds found himself doing something that seemed to go against all conventional wisdom. Like a prospector who knows gold from fool's gold, by taking time to study each find, he began instituting what he calls clarity breaks. Deliberate pauses in the creative process that weren't about avoiding work, but about making the work itself more meaningful, like letting coffee grounds settle before taking that first sip. The true power of this principle revealed itself during a high-stakes creative decision. While everyone around him was rushing to judgment like a herd of spooked cattle, Reynolds chose to implement what he terms a marination period. Just like good barbecue can't be rushed, he'd step back, let the thoughts settle like dust after a storm, and wait for clarity to emerge naturally, like morning dew on desert sage. This wasn't procrastination wearing a fancy mask, mind you. It was strategic stillness, as deliberate as a hunter's pause before taking the shot, as purposeful as a farmer waiting for the right moment to plant. Each pause had its purpose, each moment of reflection its role in the larger journey, like a river gathering strength before carving through mountain stone. Let me tell you something about how this changes everything. It's like learning the difference between a horse that's refusing to move out of stubbornness and one that's sensing danger ahead. When you understand the difference between running from a task and pausing to see it clearly, the whole game changes. Reynolds found that these strategic pauses didn't just improve his decisions, they transformed his entire relationship with time and action. You see, these weren't the kind of breaks that leave you feeling guilty, like you're avoiding what needs to be done. They were more like the pause a master craftsman takes to sharpen his tools, a vital part of the work itself, as important as any action that follows. And just like that, craftsman knows the value of a well-honed blade. Reynolds discovered that a well-timed pause can cut through confusion cleaner than any rushed action. Principle 6. Momentum through micro-commitments. You know how the hardest part of any journey is often that first step? Like when the trail ahead looks long enough to swallow the horizon and your feet feel heavier than wet cement. Well, let me tell you about how Reynolds discovered a truth about motion that changed everything. Let me tell you something about momentum that the ancient Stoics understood deep in their bones. It ain't about grand gestures or heroic leaps. It's about those tiny commitments, smaller than a mustard seed, that grow into something unstoppable. Reynolds discovered this truth when facing a project so massive, it made mountains look like molehills. Now here's where it gets interesting. Instead of getting tangled up in the enormity of his goals, Reynolds developed what he calls the pebble practice. You see, just like a single pebble can start an avalanche, he found that one small commitment, honored daily, could create the kind of momentum that moves mountains. During the development of a challenging creative venture, when the weight of expectations felt heavy enough to bend steel, Reynolds didn't try to lift the whole load at once. Instead, he committed to what he calls sunrise decisions. One small non-negotiable action taken before the day could throw its shadows of doubt. Not something grand or heroic, mind you, but something as simple as making one crucial phone call or writing one important paragraph. You see, this approach ain't about thinking small. It's about understanding how big things really happen, like how the Grand Canyon wasn't carved by one mighty flood, but by countless drops of water, patient and persistent. Reynolds applied this wisdom by breaking down overwhelming projects into what he calls breath-sized bites. Commitments so small, they felt almost laughable at first. The true magic of this principle showed itself in how these tiny commitments created a sort of gravitational pull toward action. Once that first small step was taken, the next one seemed to call out like an old friend. One decision led to another. One small victory invited its brothers and sisters to the party. Pretty soon, what started as a trickle had turned into a river of unstoppable progress. Let me tell you something about how this changes everything about tackling big dreams. When you understand that momentum doesn't start with a bang, but with a whisper, procrastination loses its favorite weapon, overwhelm. It's like starting a campfire. You don't begin with the big logs. You start with the tiny twigs and let nature take its course. This principle became clearest when Reynolds faced what seemed like an impossible deadline. Instead of getting paralyzed by the scope of it all, he turned each day into a series of tiny promises kept. Write one page, make one sketch, have one conversation. Each small commitment was like laying down another stone in a path that would eventually stretch clear across any obstacle. You see, what makes this approach so powerful is that it sneaks right past our brain's resistance to big changes. It's like taming a wild horse. You don't just jump on and hope for the best. You start with small moments of trust, tiny victories that build one upon another until what once seemed impossible becomes as natural as breathing. You know, there's something almost magical about watching someone transform their battle with procrastination into a victory story. Like watching the sun break through storm clouds after days of rain, or seeing spring flowers push through the last patches of winter snow. Through Reynolds' journey, we've uncovered wisdom that's older than the hills, but as fresh as morning dew. Truths about how we face our daily battles, about the space between thinking and doing. Let me tell you something about transformation that brings all these pieces together like a master weaver working at their loom. Each principle we've explored, they're like streams flowing into the same river. There's the wisdom of knowing what's yours to control, like a rancher knowing which parts of the land need tending. The power of living in this moment right here, like a tracker reading fresh signs. The strength that comes from embracing the hard paths, like a tree growing stronger in the wind. The foundation of preparation, solid as bedrock. The wisdom of strategic pausing, like a river gathering strength before the rapids. And the unstoppable force of momentum built one small step at a time, like a canyon carved by countless drops of water. Now, here's where your own story starts to get interesting. These aren't just fine ideas to admire from a distance, like paintings in a museum. They're tools as real as a hammer in your hand or a rope at your saddle. Whether you're facing a creative challenge that seems as vast as the Montana sky, building something from the ground up, or just trying to wrangle that task you've been circling like a cautious coyote, the path forward is as clear as tracks in fresh snow. You see, what Reynolds came to understand, what those ancient Stoics knew in their bones, is that procrastination isn't really about time slipping through your fingers like desert sand. It's about your relationship with action itself, like learning to trust a horse beneath you. Every time you choose to move forward, no matter how small that step might be, you're not just beating procrastination. You're rebuilding your entire understanding of what's possible, like a sunrise changing how you see familiar landscape. Let me tell you something about the road ahead. The next time procrastination tries to set up camp in your mind, remember you're carrying tools that have weathered every storm time could throw at them. Tools that turned an anxious actor into a force of nature. Tools that can transform your own story just as surely as spring transforms the mountainside. This is Rise Stoically, reminding you that the wisdom of the ages isn't just alive. It's calling you to put it to use like a wild horizon calling to the pioneer spirit in all of us. Until next time, when we'll explore how another modern icon brings ancient wisdom to life in ways that'll make you see your own struggles in a whole new light. keep rising like the morning sun over untamed country.